Okay, so in this video, I basically just want to tie up a few loose ends from chapter 12. This is kind of the end part of chapter 12 and a few things we didn't discuss. So we've been talking about a lot of different types of land use, and I wanted to go back and just talk a little bit more about agriculture. So we covered a lot of agriculture in chapter 10, but now we want to think specifically as to how much land use there is from agriculture. So in fact, about 38% of the Earth's terrestrial surface is actually dedicated to agriculture. So that's either pasture land or crops, and basically arable land. And one of the things throughout most of history is we've been trying to increase agricultural land. And wetlands have been seen as kind of not really wanted, right? There's a lot of mosquitoes, and it's thought of as land that could be better used for agriculture. So throughout most of the U.S. history, we've actually encouraged farmers to get rid of wetlands, to drain the wetlands. And in fact, the Swampland Acts were pretty much, that was the whole goal, was to basically encourage farmers to drain wetlands and put them into agricultural use. And some of the good part of this was that it eradicated malaria. So you may not know, but malaria was actually prevalent in a lot of the southern U.S. But getting rid of a lot of those wetlands pretty much got rid of malaria. It put 10 million hectares of new farmland into rotation. And even up till 1940, the USDA was providing assistance to farmers. So the assistance was basically, again, promoting agricultural use. But of course, since then, we've also come to realize how valuable wetlands are. Remember all those ecosystem services. So things like flood prevention, filtering pollutants out, habitat, especially for things like migratory birds. So we've really come to realize how important those systems are. And so the Wetland Reserve Program was put into existence basically to try to then reconvert that agricultural use back into wetlands and see if we can't recover some of those benefits from wetlands. Okay. And then we said there's a lot of land that's also just pasture land. So livestock graze about 1/4 of the Earth's land. And we talked a little bit about poorly managed versus sustainably managed. So, overgrazing is obviously not good, but there probably are ways to do sort of rotational grazing that can be better managed. And in the U.S., a lot of that management of public lands and grazing rights is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And we talked a little bit about that, about how the government basically leases lands and then farmers can put their livestock on it. Okay. I also want to say just a little bit more about parks and reserves. So there's basically a few reasons that people have created these spaces where we're trying to sort of preserve or conserve at least some of that natural beauty. So some of it's monumentalism. So just this idea that there's a space, think of the Grand Canyon, that we just need to save just because of what's there, and we're trying to preserve that. For recreational purposes, right? I don't know if you've been whitewater rafting or you like to hike, people that hunt, all of those things that those parks and reserves provide. Utilitarian benefits. So it could be usefulness, right? Resources that those places provide, those ecosystem services. Sometimes we actually designate those lands because they're not economically valuable. So it's easier to preserve them if they're not wanted for something else. And then, of course, just to try to help preserve biodiversity is becoming a bigger issue. All right, so the world's first national park was established in Yellowstone in 1872. And then there was kind of a lot happening kind of at the beginning of the 1900s. So Theodore Roosevelt was really into preserving these national spaces. So the Antiquities Act came about in 1906, And this basically allowed the president to designate national monuments. So you may hear of this if you listen to the news about national monuments. And it's kind of a first step that once something's designated a national monument, it can then maybe sometime in the future be designated a national park. So it's kind of just that first step. National wildlife refuges were started in 1903. In 1964, so then we had this kind of gap. But again, think 1960s, right? We're starting to be more conscious of conservation and pollution and things like that. So in 1964, the Wilderness Act came into being. And the idea with the Wilderness Act was to really start setting aside lands that were just wilderness. So they're basically off limit to other types of development. All right, some of those the national parks, the monuments, there's varying uses for all of those. So some of them allow some development, some resource use, whereas the Wilderness Act really designated wilderness areas that the idea is to leave them in more pristine state. So no development except a few that were grandfathered in. We talked a little bit about the controversies, local versus federal control. And we can include in that sort of the rights of indigenous people and their use of that particular land. There are also efforts on regional and local levels, so state parks you should be pretty familiar with. And then there are private nonprofit groups, such as the Nature Conservancy, that buy land to put it basically in trust to prevent development. Okay, so that's the U.S. Other countries have kind of followed our example, and a lot of countries have set up their own systems of national parks. And it varies as to how successful those have been. All right, some areas are very successful. Some countries set up national parks, but they may not have the resources or the willpower to really police those areas. So sometimes people will say those are paper parks. So on paper, the laws are there for conservation, but in effect, maybe those laws aren't being followed and, the forest is still being burnt down, for instance. The United Nations has a section that's the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which I will now refer to as UNESCO. And that basically sets up World Heritage Sites. And those World Heritage Sites, some of them are cultural, but they also set up sites that are more sort of natural resources. And so this slide sort of gives you the 4 things that UNESCO is looking for. So outstanding examples of Earth's record of life or its geological processes, ongoing ecological and biological evolutionary processes, natural phenomenon, and habitats for rare or endangered animals or plants. So examples of this would be the Galapagos Islands, for example, or the wetlands, the Pantanal in South America is considered a World Heritage Site. And the idea is that UNESCO actually then also gives funds for establishing and maintaining some of these sites. All right, another thing we have to think about with international is some of these parks and natural areas don't obey political boundaries. So the idea of setting up transboundary parks. So for instance, in Africa, there are a few transboundary parks that are monitored by different countries. The US and Canada have a couple on our northern border as well. And that has kind of the same issues that we talked about way back when we talked about Tijuana and managing those transboundary like pollution issues. Okay, one of the other things people have tried to do sort of internationally through the UN is set up these biosphere reserves. So the idea is to couple preservation with sustainable development. Okay, so in other words, we don't really want to just kick people out from an area and say you can't develop it when that's their livelihood. So we're trying to combine as best we can. And the idea is you set up this core area that's devoted only to biodiversity preservation. And then as you go out, you get more and more development the further away from that core area. And so it allows people to sort of use that resource to some extent and also benefit from it. Okay. One thing to keep in mind, and these next few slides you've seen before, I forget in what unit, but forest fragmentation is really a big problem when you start dividing up forested area into these little chunks. And remember, we talked about edge effects, that it's not the same in the middle of this area as it is on the edge. And if you have more edges, then it may very well affect biodiversity. And insights for this were gained from the study of island biogeography theory. So remember, this was the idea that you can predict using the island size and how far it is from the mainland, what the species richness looks like. And so you consider this fragmented forest as sort of islands on land and think about what that means, okay? So here's again our sort of review of that. So more species are going to be closer if the island's closer to the mainland. If the island's bigger from the mainland, you get more species. And also, the larger it is, the less likelihood you have of something going extinct. Okay, so given that, as people think about designing parks and reserves, there's kind of this dilemma that we love acronyms, so it's called the SLOSS dilemma: single large or several small. So should you designate just the biggest area you can and have one of those, or should you have several, maybe scattered ones that are smaller in size? And it really might depend on like what kind of animals live there and what you're trying to do. So obviously something like a tiger is going to need large areas of land to support a viable population, whereas insects may need just small sort of safe spaces that work as reservoirs for that particular insect. In with that, we're also thinking about, corridors. Can we connect those small areas to allow animals passage through them? Okay, so I think that sums up a lot of the stuff. Take a look, skim through the chapter, especially look at the illustrations and the pictures. That always gives you a good overview of what a chapter is trying to say. And I will see you later.